on 365 Sports. Here's a note about the SEC. You know, you can talk about whatever you want. The Big 12, Pac-12, and ACC all had a pretty good number. But then there was the SEC, and then there was the Big 10. I did not realize this. I know how dominant they've been really since about, the early to mid-2000s, which has been about 17 years. 17 consecutive years they've had more players drafted than any conference in America. There wasn't like a jump from one conference or another. And this is in the 2000s, the Big 12 had some pretty good teams, including Texas and Oklahoma were both fighting to win the title and also the championship. Baylor had a pretty good run, of course, starting in 2010 with a rush. Nebraska was still a part of the conference, among others. But that is an absolutely amazing stat. The national titles, the numbers, and then that one too, with how many have been drafted, 17 consecutive years.
You know, it'd be interesting to go back and kind of do a timeline of things that happened that kind of helped, that the SEC, events around the country that kind of happened that the SEC capitalized on. I think they, before everybody else, really capitalized on social media really well. One of the things that Urban Meyer did at Florida that the other coaches in the, that he was competing against while he was there weren't doing, where he was reaching out to kids on Twitter and Facebook. And so much to the point where they had to make a rule about it because there wasn't one. But, at the time when he got the job at Florida, Bobby Bowden was at Florida State. Do you think Bobby Bowden ever got on a cell phone and sent a tweet? No, he never did. He was an older coach. So they had some younger coaches at the time who kind of got out in front of everything. Then they just started winning and winning and winning, and they really capitalized on who they were and, kind of looking around and seeing the other things that were going on. They kind of came together before everyone else did outwardly and really rolled on with it. So for whatever you may feel about the whole depth of the SEC, they've done the best job of running their league for 20 years now of anybody, and it's because they figured a lot of stuff out before everyone else got on board.
Yeah, they were ahead of the curve. I think they've had some good coaching choices as well. I think the marketing has been exceptional. I think the propaganda, and I don't mean that in a negative way, was a how-to on how to make your conference the king of all conferences. I mean, ESPN had a lot to do with that in their coverage of the SEC, and let's not, act like there wasn't this pivot in the mid-2000s to where all of a sudden I grew up, I don't think I heard about the SEC ever. As far as outside of a game, and I know there weren't as many talk shows back then or whatever, but it was not a talking point. If anything, the Big 12, or
the Big 8.
The Big 8 prior to that
Pac-12
were talked about that way, or the Pac-12, but it wasn't an SEC thing. And then about the mid-2000s, it did. Once LSU beat Oklahoma and kind of got the ball rolling, and then here comes Saban in Alabama, and then everybody started, the Florida, Tebow, Urban Meyer, that whole crew left their impact, and then Alabama again, and then you had little just jumps in there from an Auburn or an LSU, who I again said kicked it off with the win over Oklahoma when they weren't expected to win that game, but got a home game basically, and got a Sooners team that was being talked about like they were the greatest of all time, and went and put it on them, and won a big game, and that just really set off the chain of events. I wonder if one little thing happens early on like that, they don't win that game, for example, Oklahoma wins it instead. Is history dramatically different? Is everything still go the same way? I don't know, but they kicked it off, and who could have ever had predicted, no matter if you're one of the brains behind the scenes, that the mad scientist that cooked a lot of this up, even still, you couldn't have predicted it would turn into what it turned into. But yeah, it helps also to have 14 teams. That's one thing. You don't see a lot of qualifications now. Granted, you could give 4 teams to other conferences and they still wouldn't be within 30 of the SEC, but they do have 14 teams, so that adds on to the total. They're about to have 16. Oklahoma and Texas would have added another 10 picks this year. And I don't know what the average will technically be, but it's awfully impressive. And it's impressive, too, when, it does help to have 2 teams right there at the top who are putting 10 guys apiece in the NFL draft. They don't have just one team putting 10 guys in one draft. They have 2 teams putting 20 guys total. 2 teams putting 20 players in the draft all by their lonesome, not to mention 12 other schools that contribute to that in some way, form, or fashion. So, they've they've got the full meal deal from top to bottom, great coaching, great players, but they've also got a couple dynasties they're in the midst of as well. And, yeah, it's just it's been exceptionally impressive to see how that's all been built up over time.
It's different positions. It's not like where some schools or conferences might have maybe some defensive backs or wide receivers, running backs or quarterbacks. Where they absolutely clean up is the depth of greatness, and it's true, or at least elite play at the defensive line position. That's where Dave Aranda said that the defensive lineman in the SEC is just a different, I guess you could say, breed of type player, different cat, so to speak, where they just go. And so that also adds to it. It's not just that they have a bunch of this or that, they have a bunch of everything. But that's a note. That surprised me, and some people are tired of hearing it, but there's truth, and there's a fact. It's 17 consecutive years they've had the most players drafted in the NFL consecutively. Now,
the Big Ten had more after round 2, I believe.
Yeah, they had a great run.
Margin. They had a good start, but they couldn't quite close it out. They ended up about 7 short, and then the Big 12 was well behind that. I was having you go from SEC had 62, Big Ten had 55, but they had more after round 2, which I think you'd almost like take that as a minor win because that means you had more guys in the top couple rounds.
Spread out, yeah.
But then, huge drop off to the ACC, 23 less players going from second place to third place. And then there's the Big 12 right there, 2 back of ACC at 30, Pac-12, 3 back of the Big 12 at 27. And I was having a conversation with Grace on the podcast today, and I kind of understand where he's coming from. We were talking about the draft. He's talking about, the Big 12 needs to produce more, and they need to, close the gap with the SEC and the Big 10. And I told him, I said, well, that the Big 12 had like the best first round they've had in since Nebraska and Colorado and Missouri and A&M were all in the conference. Since 2011, that was the best first round the Big 12 has had in over 10 years. So I definitely don't want to use this year as the year to poo-poo on them because if anything, we should celebrate. They got shut out 2 years in a row in the first round. They had 6 this year. But as far as catching up, I had to tell him, and I said, those days are over, buddy. That's not ever going to happen. That is never going to happen unless the Big 12 in 20 years adds about another 8 teams and 5 of them all start putting 5 apiece in there. And even still, I don't know if that'll play catch up. So those days of it not being the SEC or the Big Ten for that matter, I don't know that we'll ever see that again, just the way the world's working now.
Those 2 leagues are going to have 16 teams. So even on a bad year, you're probably going to get 7 from each league. If they had the worst down year in their conferences you could possibly imagine, you're probably going to randomly get 7 or 8, right? In the first round. Rounders. You're going to get 7 or 8 first rounders on the worst year you can possibly imagine. Yep. So because you have 16 teams, you're ahead of everybody else. The Big 12 is only going to have 12. The Pac is only going to have 10. So those conferences to have a year where they have the most players drafted, not only first round draft picks, players drafted is going to have to be just stacked teams. Yeah. But
and by the way, the Big Ten and the SEC are about to add 4 schools that have produced NFL talent with Texas OU. No matter the stretch that Texas had in the first round, they've still produced players. And then USC and UCLA, they have fed the NFL themselves. All right, so